In this Diablo 4 video, I'm going to be showing you the Twisted Blades Rogue build. This is a Shadow Rogue that uses the Twisting Blades skill, which is a melee skill to inflict massive AoE damage. And this is a beginner rogue build aimed at world tiers 1 and 2, so if you've been looking for a good beginner melee rogue build, then this video is for you. The way this build works is by using the Shadow Imbuement skill in combination with Twisting Blades to generate a chain reaction of explosions that decimates big groups of enemies. To achieve this, you'll start the fight by casting the Shadow Imbuement buff, and then you'll head straight into a pack of enemies and perform 2 attacks with Twisting Blades. Once this has been accomplished, you'll now dash through the group of enemies, landing on the opposite side of them, and start attacking using the Invigorating Strike skill, and this will help to build up combo points and increase your energy regeneration. At this point, the first 2 attacks you made with Twisting Blades will return to you, passing through the enemies that you attack, and this will deal damage to all of them and apply the Shadow Imbuement debuff, which will generate a chain reaction of explosions. Also, because of the advanced Twisting Blades upgrade, both your Shadow Imbuement and dash cooldowns will be reduced, and thanks to consuming shadows, you'll get back the energy you spent, allowing you to restart this sequence. The aspect that will help the most here is the Blade Dancer's aspect, making it so that the returning blades orbit around you in the end to deal extra damage, which is very useful to finish off enemies or to deal with elites. The new orbit damage is further amplified based on the enemies pierced by the boomerang effect, and you can acquire the Codex of Power for this aspect by completing the Jalal's Vigil dungeon located in Skoss Glen. I recommend using the combo point specialization to fight regular enemies, as it'll increase the damage of your Twisting Blades, and it'll also give you a speed buff that you should swap to Inner Sight specialization when fighting bosses. Doing so will allow you to spam the Twisting Blades skill when Inner Sight is active, dealing a ton of damage and generating a massive amount of orbiting blades that quickly tick the boss's health down. Remember that you'll also invest points into the Shadow Clone Ultimate to be able to summon your shadow who will mimic this action, further increasing your burst damage. There are several ways to use this build depending on the enemies that you're facing, and these are going to change depending on whether you're facing like a large group of enemies or a boss. So let's start with group of enemies first, and then we'll talk about how to handle bosses after that. So first, let's talk about Shadow Imbuement. Now, obviously, this is going to change the damage that you deal to shadow damage, and when you're using this on the Twisted Blades Rogue, you're going to pick shadow damage to convert your damage to this type and infect multiple targets. To infect a target, you must strike with a Shadow Imbued skill, and we'll achieve this by first sticking a Shadow Imbued Twisting Blades into an enemy and then making it pass through the other enemies when it returns to us. When an infected target is killed, it will explode, dealing massive damage to all surrounding enemies, generating a chain reaction that decimates large groups. In addition, our blended Shadow Imbuement upgrade will make them vulnerable, so after the first explosion, everything else will die even faster. Twisting Blades is of course the key to this build because of its boomerang effect. Enemies often attack you in a line pattern, so you'll want to strike the first 1 or 2 enemies and then reposition behind them, and then after 1.5 seconds the blades will return to you, passing through the pack and applying the Shadow debuff, and dealing massive individual damage thanks to the enhanced Twisting Blades passive, which will allow you to kill some enemies and trigger the chain explosion. You'll of course want to prioritize positioning to maximize the amount of enemies you hit when the blades return, as each enemy hit will reduce all of your active cooldowns by 0.25 seconds for each enemy hit, thanks to the advanced Twisting Blades upgrade. So next, let's take a look at Invigorating Strike. This is your basic skill that allows you to deal a little damage, but it also increases your energy regeneration and has a 50% lucky hit chance, which is very nice to have. Since we'll be using the combo point specialization for this build against regular enemies, each attack you perform will give you 1 combo point with this. Ideally, you'll want to use your starter combination of Shadow Imbuement and then Twisting Blades to then dash behind an enemy group and start to attack or perform 3 attacks with Invigorating Strike, and this will give you plus 20% energy regeneration or 50% if the enemy is either injured or crowd control. Also, if you happen to have a very good lucky hit chance skill on your equipment, you can also go for primary Invigorating Strike to further increase the proc chance, but it's not mandatory. Next, let's talk about Dash. We'll be using Dash to quickly navigate through the open map and also to quickly reposition behind the pack of enemies at the beginning of the fight. Note that Dash has 2 charges, so make sure you always have at least 1 charge available when engaging a group of enemies, or you won't be able to reposition to activate your combo. You won't need enhancements for this skill since it'll be primarily used for movement. Moving on, let's take a look at Shadow Step. Shadow Step is our essential survival tool for this Twisting Blades build, since your health and defenses aren't really that great. When activated, you'll automatically gain Unstoppable, which removes and prevents all crowd controlling effects, and this allows you to break out of critical situations such as getting frozen or stunned. In addition, this skill will perform a lucky hit with a 100% chance on the target enemy and provides you 50% movement speed for 2 seconds, giving you the chance to drink a potion and reposition in a safe place. You can also use Shadow Step to quickly reposition behind an enemy to take full advantage of the Twisting Blades boomerang effect, but you should only do this if you're certain you're not going to get affected by a crowd controlling effect. You won't need enhancements or upgrades for this skill since we're mainly just using it as an emergency survival tool. Passives you want for this build are Shadow Crash to gain access to consuming shadows. Shadow Crash raises the chances of stunning enemies when they receive shadow damage, which works great for elites, but the skill you really want is Consuming Shadows, hence the 2-point investment. This lets you generate all the energy you spend in the combo provided that you kill them with a Shadow Imbuement. Other passives you'll want to take are Exploit and Malice. Exploit increases the damage you deal to both healthy and injured enemies. Since you first deal damage to enemies when they're healthy, and then you deal damage to the remaining ones when they're injured, this is practically active all the time. Malice increases the damage you deal to vulnerable enemies, which synergizes perfectly with the blended Shadow Imbuement that makes enemies vulnerable after the explosions. So now that we've got those out of the way, let's talk a little bit about boss fights and how they're handled with this build. They're handled a little bit differently than groups of enemies, and the first thing you want to do is swap your specialization from combo points to Inner Sight. Inner Sight allows you to fill up a gauge when attacking the marked enemy. Bosses are often alone, so you'll be filling the gauge by attacking it. Once the gauge is full, you'll gain unlimited energy for 4 seconds. At that moment, you'll want to spawn your Shadow Clone, cast Shadow Imbuement, and then start spamming Twisting Blades as much as you can. As the blades return, they will circle around you, stacking tons of damage on the boss. So Shadow Clone is the ultimate ability that we'll be using for this build, and what it does is it summons a shadow copy of yourself that mimics your actions, so that's why when you summon it and then you use Shadow Imbuement, it will do the same, and then when you spam Twisting Blades, it will also do the same, and it's a great way to increase our single target damage. Now, it doesn't do as much damage as you do, but it's still going to copy your motions and is fantastic for boss fights. You can also invest in the Prime Shadow Clone upgrade to have another option that makes you unstoppable every time Shadow Clone is activated, and this can be useful like on higher difficulties of the game or in some situations. Final tips. Things you should look out on your gear are Dexterity, Intelligence, Maximum Energy, plus rank to relevant skills, Critical Strike Chance, Critical Strike Damage, damage to close enemies, Imbuement skill damage, core skill damage, energy cost reduction, and cooldown reduction. Damage reduction is also good to pick up when you're susceptible to taking lots of damage in melee range. But what I would suggest doing, because this is a beginner build, is not focusing too much on these things. These are nice to look at on gear to see if it's good when you're like finding new gear. But don't try and just get all of these on all of your gear, because your gear changes way too much when you're leveling up. But these are just things that you should look out for, but don't worry if you don't have all of them, and you always take like the best piece of gear that you can find. Another tip is that when you're running around on the map or you're going through a dungeon, it's not a bad idea to pull multiple groups of enemies together to get better clear speed, because you're going to AoE them all down with massive explosions. So it actually goes much, much faster if you don't just do one pull at a time or one small pull at a time. You want to try and group huge groups of enemies to take most advantage of this build, so try and group them up into bigger groups if possible. When it comes to legendary aspects, you'll want to look out for Aspect of Lethal Dusk and Ravenous Aspect for this build. Lethal Dusk grants stealth when evading through a Shadow Imbuement affected enemy, which is great if you need to recover or reposition, and it'll give you a buff that grants you 1 to 5% of your maximum life recovered on kill for 4 seconds, which will be a lot of life that you can gain. And the Ravenous Aspect rewards you with increased energy regeneration when you slay a vulnerable enemy, and this works really well with blended Shadow Imbuement because that happens all the time. So that wraps up our beginner Twisting Blades rogue build. I hope that gets you started on the right direction with a rogue for some good melee damage if you're looking for a good melee rogue build. We'll of course have ranged rogue builds as well, and we'll have a lot more mid and end game builds, but that's just an idea to get you going. And one thing I want to mention too is that you do not need to play on World 2 in this game if you're struggling with your build, especially getting it together at the beginning of the game, because all it does is give you more experience and gives you more gold, which when you're playing on World Tier 1, you actually probably come out about even because your clear speed will be faster. You don't get a better drop rate by being on World 2. And the other thing is the faster you level up, the faster enemies level up. So that makes a lot of your gear obsolete more quickly. So if you're struggling, try playing on World 1.